my name is Megan Redshaw, and you are watching another episode of Legal Watch. Today, we have Hedley Rees back with us to talk about big pharma outsourcing, or their love affair with outsourcing, and how this has to end. Hedley Rees is the managing consultant of PharmaFlowLimited, a UK-based consultancy specializing in supply chain management within the pharmaceutical and life science sectors. His clients range from large pharmaceutical companies to emerging biotech, and also includes investors, lawyers, and other consultancies, facility design and build specialists, and third-party logistics providers. His assignments span preclinical, clinical, and commercial supply chains up to complex multi-product networks covering global territories. Mr. Rees formerly served in senior positions at Bayer UK, British Biotech, Vernalis, Orthoclinical Diagnostics, and OSI Pharmaceuticals. Mr. Rees, thank you for joining us once again today on Legal Watch.
It's a pleasure to be here, Megan. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. And that was a very kind introduction to me, so thanks very much for that.
Well, I wanted our listeners to know that you know what you're talking about, because today we're going to be discussing pharmaceutical companies and this overall issue of them outsourcing their various practices, which my understanding is that you believe is not a good idea and is definitely not a positive thing for investors. Is this correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to put outsourcing in context. It's not a bad thing in itself, but it has to be properly measured. And over the last 40 years, the industry has outsourced almost every physical activity, or it has divested assets that have been taken over by other companies, and they have grown the businesses. So with all the outsourcing, big pharma has really retrenched into opposite ends of the drug development life cycle, from discovery research, which is molecular modeling and picking target candidates to develop, to sales and marketing. The whole piece in the middle does not belong to big pharma. So I'm going to explain how that's the case, and some of the impacts of it. We have to go back, first of all, to the mid-1980s. There was a battle between two drug companies, SmithKline & French and Glaxo, who both developed anti-ulcer drugs. The SmithKline & French drug was called Tagamet, and that launched in 1976. That was a 12-year development program, and Sir James Black, who headed up the program, had a Nobel Prize, and he was commended for his very well integrated and carried out program. In 1981, 5 years later, Glaxo launched a drug called Zantac, and that took just 5 years. And the head of the program, Sir David Jack, basically said, all we did was copy the process, and this is in his obituary, so it is documented. All we did is copy the process, and by doing that, we could make a cleaner process, and some of the side effects that were reduced. The net result then was Glaxo was able to use sales and marketing to be able to target side effects, and they were outselling Tagamet 3-1 within a few years. And we're going up there to the mid-1980s. Now, that sent a message that with a patented compound and sales and marketing, you didn't need anything else. That was all you needed. So the industry began to divest its warehousing and storage of finished goods, and it supplied to pharmacies and clinics. It divested its manufacturing facilities, its drug development facilities, and very soon the whole industry was becoming dependent on these third-party organizations who were doing the physical heavy lifting. Now, what I'm saying is that outsourcing for elements of or parts of an operation or company activities that can be well defined and that can be explained to the companies you're outsourcing to, and they don't have to bring any of their intellectual property into it. that's fine. But in situations like drug development, where you're looking for these organizations to actually bring the skills to the party, bring the knowledge and the experience to be able to develop these products for you, that's very different, because it's very easy to get locked in to particular suppliers and particular contractors, particularly since drug development, changing any supplier or any element of drug development has to be done very closely and carefully managed so that it doesn't disrupt the supply chain and the regulations are maintained. So I'll go into this in a bit more detail, but what my message here is that we now have a very fragmented industry made up of service providers from early stage preclinical, these would be contract research organizations, and contract development and manufacturing organizations making the clinical trial supplies, right the way through to the finished products that are being taken to pharmacies and hospitals. And the pharmaceutical companies have no role to play in that, because they sell to the wholesalers, and that's the last they take part in it. So I'm going to talk to some of the issues associated with this outsourcing. First of all, I just want to introduce you to a little passage from, this is Find It, File It, Flog It, and it's a book I wrote in 2015. The title means is the current development paradigm with Big Pharma is find the molecule, patent it, hand it over to contractors to file it and get it approved, and then flog it. I'm not sure if that's a term familiar in America, but it means sell it with all the verve and vigor you could possibly muster. So, and in the book, I have various expert witnesses, and one expert witness I have is Professor Andrew Cox. Now, Professor Cox is a world-leading academic and expert in procurement and outsourcing. He doesn't just, obviously, he covers all industry sectors from the top companies across all disciplines. He's very well known across all industry, and he's regarded as something of a legend. So this is what Andrew said. I do have to put my glasses on, hang on. I'm at that time of life now where I can't read without glasses. So this is what he says. Unfortunately for the major pharmaceutical companies that used to be the channel captains who controlled the industry and all of its major supply chains through a judicious control internally of critical assets, there has been considerable evidence of very poor practice in outsourcing in recent years. This has led to the loss of critical assets, post-contractual moral hazard, and poor post-contractual management of suppliers. So what he is saying is that any company has critical assets, and these are the assets that allow you to differentiate yourself from competition. So, and by outsourcing your development processes and your skills, you have given away your ability to develop differentiated products, the products that are better than the competition, so people come to you rather than the competition. What he means by post-contractual moral hazard is once you've outsourced, then you soon become in a very weak position, because that supplier, you are locked into that supplier because they have all the skills, they have all the experience, you have a dependence on them, particularly because if they are registered in the filing, which they will be. And then the post-contractual management it's very difficult to manage contractors in a situation where they have all the experience and skills. So just in principle, we have this situation. Now, there is an analogy, the Dreamliner, and I've got the link here. Boeing decided to outsource its development when it started to design the Dreamliner, and they outsourced, instead of outsourcing typically 45-50% of its materials and and the equipment, it outsourced roughly 65%. And there was a major cost overrun and major delay in the launch. It was something like a 3-year delay in launch and a $2 billion cost overrun. And that's because the company developing have to have control of the development process. They have to be telling their suppliers what they have to do, how they have to work together. And if you take outsourcing too far, it becomes a bit of a confused, I won't say mess, but there are significant issues of control and management of the supply base. And so we do have several examples of how outsourcing, if it's not done properly. Andrew Cox talks about the make versus buy decision. You decide what you're going to keep in-house and make yourself, and you decide what you outsource. And that's a critical decision. And it's all about, do we need these assets because this is what helps us make profit and money? Or can we outsource these activities because they're fairly easy to manage and define, and that will save us cost? So, and that's the process you have to go through.
I have a question, if I can interrupt for just a minute. Okay, so there's obviously a lot of downsides to outsourcing. That's what I'm hearing you saying, that this is a negative for the pharmaceutical industry. What incentive then why would the pharmaceutical industry want to do this? Why would they want to outsource it if there's so many negative implications? Or is it the fact that there's negative implications for others, but not for the pharmaceutical company itself?
Well, it was in the mid 1980s, lots of companies were doing it. It was a bit of a fad. And if you remember, pharmaceutical industry took it to the extent where they moved to offshore, what we call to low-cost countries to source basically fairly cheap active ingredients and intermediate products anyway. So to save a few pence on the cost of the drug, they went to Asia, China, and we've still experienced that with COVID now. We know that 80-90% of this raw and starting materials are sourced from China. So that was a type of outsourcing in terms of, moving to companies that were going to be lower cost and, but also associated with the whole complexity of communication really exploded. And then we have the outsourcing itself, where again, for early stage development, there's really, there needs to be a strong communication between the suppliers you're working with, because you have to be, that's the foundational stage, and you have to be working with them. So I don't know if I'm answering your question or not here, but the important thing is that outsourcing is professionally managed to key criteria around critical assets. And it seems that the pharma industry followed the fad and even took it to an extreme. I don't think there's any industry in the world that has outsourced all its physical assets. And we know that big pharma companies now are made up of discovery research, which is basically the science, molecular modeling, and then sales and marketing. The bit in between is in the hands of third parties. So there's issues of cost escalation because you can't, if you want to, if you've got a project going, you're paying the contractors to do the project. If suddenly internally you want to change priorities for some reason, if it's all internal, you can move people from one job to another. It doesn't cost you anything, because they're employed by you anyway. You can, retarget them. In outsourced supply chains, you would have to pay the cancellation costs of the program that was already running, and then you'd have to pay for the new program. Now, these costs are millions of dollars. If you ask a contract development organization to change a project, you have to, they have to work out all the people assigned to the project. And so what you find is that there's a resistance to change anything. There's a real inertia against change because it's going to cost lots of money. So where you want the company to be innovative and thinking of new ideas and developing their products, it just isn't happening. So that's a key downside of not having internal control and communication of the key aspects of your business.
Do we have these, for example, with gene therapy, with Pfizer, Moderna, or Johnson & Johnson? Is this, I guess my question is this confined to a certain sector of the pharmaceutical industry, or is this playing out even with your gene therapy drugs?
Oh, absolutely. Well, we know that, when this outsourcing took place, most of the drugs were small molecule drugs, which I've mentioned this before, small molecules they're made by chemical synthesis, large chemical vessels and that, make the chemicals, the small molecules, so they can be identified by analysis. They have got good shelf life, they're stable, good shelf lives, and pretty not easy, but pretty straightforward to manage. So outsourcing didn't have such an impact then. But as you go to more complex, then we had biologics, which are living things which are more complex supply chains. And we started to see that the small molecule supply chains weren't coping very well with the needs of biologics because of the various insulated containers you had to have, and the special regulations and the whole thing. And where you wanted to control the temperatures and the supply chain, it became even more difficult. And now we've got the gene therapies, it's even more complicated because we've got some really sort of low temperature products, and they're all being handled by third-party contractors. So if we take Moderna as an example, and this is public domain via press releases, we know that for Moderna, Lonza, a Swiss company, make the drug substance for their vaccine, and that is then shipped to another company, Catalan Pharma Solutions, who do the fill finish. And another company then does the freezing down, and then logistics service providers have to move the vaccines from to the point of use, and the starting materials will have to be sourced from another company. So suddenly you're getting all these movements that need to be carefully controlled. But we've seen instances where companies haven't set the data loggers required to record temperature through a journey because for whatever reason that wasn't done. So what I'm saying is there's a lot of confusion now in areas where we need to have close communication. You take gene therapies, the autologous gene therapies, autologous means patient-specific. That's the most challenging supply chain the world has ever known. The patient is in the hospital. The patient doesn't leave the hospital. So the patient cells are extracted. There's a process of apheresis. Apheresis takes the T cells out. They're put into a bag. They're frozen down to minus 197 degrees. They are shipped off to a plant via third-party logistics providers. They go through customs. They go through, they're flown all over the place. They're flown, and there's road transport involved. The amount of movement is not conducive to treating a patient in the hospital, because once the cells have been manufactured with a genetic modification, they then have to go on the same journey back to the hospital. So that whole process takes between 2 to 6 weeks, and sometimes patients have passed away because they were ill in the first place, very ill, and they haven't managed to survive. So the today's model is stopping gene therapies, this model that we've got now, from scaling because of the logistics issues and the other issues of the contact between the doctor, the healthcare professionals, with the patient, and these cells that go hundreds of miles away and suddenly turn up. So outsourcing has now made the whole thing incredibly difficult. And there's a big question mark as to whether gene therapies will scale unless a very different healthcare professional focused model of manufacture is introduced.
What do you feel are the corrective actions that need to be taken to address this issue, or is that even practical where we're at?
Gosh, it would take a long time. In a sense, it's about rewinding the whole dynamic of outsourcing somewhere back to where it was before. When I joined the industry in 1980. I worked for Bayer in the UK manufacturing plant. I started as an industrial engineer, which really is looking at systems improvement in the company. And I ended up after 6 years running the global supply chain for the plant. And at the start, we used to make sterile injectables. We also made Alka-Seltzer, which is a well-known product, and we were supplying the whole of Europe. And the raw materials used to come in, the goods inwards. They used to be tested, accepted. They'd go into storage. They then go into be mixed and blended. They'd be compressed into tablets. The tablets would be packed in foil. They'd be packed into cartons, into shipping outers, and then they would go to dispatch, and they would be shipped all over the UK to hospitals and pharmacies. And there'd be a very direct link between the customers. Customers, pharmacies could ring up and say, "Oh, I've had a complaint from a customer." I don't know if you remember, but in the olden days, Alka-Seltzer used to be in glass bottles with you're too young to know, but with a screw cap on it, and there was a polystyrene insert to stop the tablets moving around. It looked very much like a tablet, and customers used to send this polystyrene piece back saying, "My tablet wouldn't dissolve." Well, yeah, we sort of knew, well, no, it's not going to dissolve because it's a packing piece. But they were able to make contact with the plant, and they'd get a complimentary sort of bottle of Alka-Seltzer to make up for the inconvenience. And so it is possible to have very integrated processes. So there was one quality system which had all the standard operating procedures. People knew each other. They worked together. They all had skin in the game because they all knew that if a launch of a product was successful, that they would benefit from it. Now, fast forward X years later, 40 years later, and the manufacturers are not the pharma companies selling the drugs. They're other companies. They're not going to benefit from any successful launch. Their only benefit to them is to be paid the fee for service, and their obligation to their boards of directors is to, maximize the fee for service. So it's a model now that's not incentivized for success. And we know that in 2006, the US Government Accountability Office issued a report that said out of 250 development candidates that are launched, only one gets to market. And of the 250, 245 fail even to get into clinical trials. So there's huge waste in drug development and a huge cost associated with that. Have I answered the question?
Yes, it did. So what's your vision moving forward?
Well,
I know you have one.
Yeah. Well, I'll use the little tale of penicillin. I think I said this before, but it's a good example. So it's a myth that penicillin was found by accident. Well, it was found by accident. Alexander Fleming came back from holidays, August 2028, and he'd set up all these petri dishes with bacteria in, and he noticed in one of them there was a mold that was killing the bacteria. And he thought, "Oh, that's interesting." But he didn't know what was active inside that mold to kill it, to kill the bacteria. So it took him 11 years to get in touch with Oxford University and the chemists there actually isolated the compound for them, and they could make small quantities, firstly to run preclinical tests, and the tests were showing it was working in animals, it was killing bacteria in animals. So here they have more evidence that this is potentially a big find. And then they also did some clinical studies, and again, patients were recovering. So they had even greater evidence that this was a big find, but they couldn't make any more than small quantities, gram quantities. So they flew off to the US Department of Agriculture and met some people there. One of them was an expert in making molds, Andrew J. Moyer, and he devised a process that increased the yield exponentially using his knowledge and skills of manufacture and obviously making molds. It was something to do with corn syrup and liquor and that sort of stuff. And he developed the process. That process was given to Merck and Pfizer and a few other companies, and it supplied World War II with the 10 quantities that they needed. So the message there is that Fleming, who was the doctor who made the discovery, but he didn't know what he was finding, the chemists who could identify what was happening in chemistry-wise in the compound, and the manufacturing guys who could actually scale the process up and make sure it worked. So if they'd all been together at the time, instead of it taking nearly 20 years for penicillin to get to market, it would have taken 4 or 5 years. So the message is, get doctors, the people who understand the chemistry and the biology, and the manufacturing people who are going to make the drug for patients, get them together, developing compounds, treat, prevention, diagnosis, and therapy all as one thing holistically. So precision medicine demands that we need to have diagnostics that can identify patients who would respond to particular treatments. And that, by that way, you have to have sensitive diagnostics that can identify different phenotypes and create stratified medicine so that you can target, more specifically what a patient needs. And then we need to develop the supply chains more strategically. We need to work with key suppliers. And these contracts, they're not bad companies, but they're good, but the relationship isn't strong enough. They are arm's length tactical relationships. We want to be working with the best suppliers who can bring their knowledge to the party of manufacture and form alliances, or, ultimately it would be good to see, big pharma taking over some contract research organizations and contract manufacturers and actually working with them, bringing those skills back into the organization. So I write a lot about that, and I've sort of written papers on it, and I should certainly be writing for Trial Site News to develop that. So
I think you definitely should.
Yeah.
Well, Mr. Rees, I wanted to thank you so much for coming back on Trial Site News Legal Watch and sharing with us all about outsourcing with pharmaceutical companies. I'm hoping that everybody who's watching this has a thorough understanding of the problems with pharmaceutical companies, outsourcing all of their practices and processes and procedures, and using third-party companies in bringing their products to market, and how we all need to come together and have more of a holistic process, including our healthcare providers in that.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, you're an expert now, so that's good.
No, I'm definitely not. I hope you will join us again soon, though, because we really enjoy having you and learning from your vast expertise.
Okay, thanks, Megan. You're welcome.
Thank you.